chat through. And I circulated the report to you all. I'm not going to do introduction slides. Today's really a time for us, hopefully, to get through and sort of iron out any final wrinkles so that Kaylee and I can work to finalize the report for our next meeting. So our next meeting is November 30th. And it's my hope that we will use that time to collectively vote on or accept or choose to make final our report draft. And in the interim between this meeting and next meeting, work on any additional material that you all need to send. And then I will circulate what I hope will be a final draft, or as close to final draft as we can make it, about a week prior to that November meeting. So hopefully right before Thanksgiving time, so that we can, again, finalize it and hopefully not need a December meeting, but we can do that if we have to. So anybody didn't receive the draft report I sent out, or did everybody get that? Okay, good. I know there were some email exchanges in between. So just reminding you all here of what our scope is for this meeting. So this group is tasked with making any recommendations to the legislature per the Commission on Connecticut's future legislation that was passed, was it a year ago? Yes, or 2 years ago now. And to make recommendations as it relates to the consolidated plan. And the consolidated plan is a document that is required by HUD, and its contents are dictated by HUD largely, that allows the state to lay out how it intends to allocate, spend several federal funding resources that come to the state from the federal government. So you all have gotten together now for many months. And the broad gist of our report is that the consolidated housing plan could serve as a larger vehicle for broader state housing planning beyond those federal funding sources, or the state could choose to align, and perhaps should choose to align, its housing planning with one document. And you've laid out 7 areas where we recommend potential consideration of topics or data points that should be included in a process of a larger housing planning document, whether that's a consolidated plan or something else. So that's where we are at this point. I will note that since I sent you the last draft, which was last week, I've received some extra information from some folks who had promised to get me some, and Kaylee and I will work to incorporate that. And I'll note as we walk through the document today where those places are, and some of you are still working on finalizing some information. So I will note where, again, those locations are in the document as we move through it. All right, so with that, I'm going to share the screen and pull up the document. Before we get moving, though, does anybody have any questions? And my intention today is just to walk through those sort of remaining bracketed items that we're outstanding on, and try to come to some conclusion on how to move forward with those before we close out. Anybody have any other questions? Okay. So I will share the screen and I will work to hopefully find the right document that I want. Oh. Hold on one second. Apologies. Oh, I thought I had this. Oh. Okay. Agenda, which you don't need. All right. All right. Can everybody see that? Okay. So I'll make note of some of the changes that we've made as I walk through so that you can identify those. You'll see changes are mostly in redlined or blue-lined text, underlined text. Kaylee went ahead, and again, a big thanks to Kaylee for doing a lot of work on this in between our meetings. You'll see the members listed here. We have to delete some email addresses that show up in here. But we listed the members of the working group, as well as the staff who have worked to support this report on the first page. I've noted the charge, as we talked about, in our broad background piece. that includes a bit of a description about what the Consolidated Housing Plan is, as well as other state laws that reference the Consolidated Housing Plan. I've inserted here a section around entitlement cities. I've forgotten who it was that brought up, it may have been Rebecca. Someone brought up the fact that entitlement cities receive funding differently than the funding that comes through HUD from the federal government. Cities like Hartford, for example, receive funding directly. So I did insert a paragraph to note that here, so that is additional thoughts on that. And I'm happy to do that. But again, this is just laying the groundwork so folks understand what the existing consolidated plan covers, what it doesn't, and how housing planning is executed and housing funding is executed elsewhere. Then we went into the problem identification section. You'll see that Kaylee has gone through and really added a lot of footnotes. The reason for that is we've cited a lot of facts and statistics in here to give folks a sense of where Connecticut is with housing, where the shortages are, and for what income brackets. And so you'll see those citations noted here, and that's so that any reader can look at this and determine where these statistics and numbers are coming from. So again, a thanks to Kaylee on that. If you have questions on any of this, please raise your hand and let me know. We've worked to try also to outline the first time they appear, any acronyms, so that folks reading this without that background also have that. And then this next section, section 4, is trying to bold and outline the specific recommendations so they're clear and they're in the front. And I believe it was Randy who wanted to ensure that we really noted the staffing capacity issue at DOH and the fact that this report does recommend that if we are to do a more complete housing planning process, that additional staffing would be needed. So you'll see that bolded here as well. I know, Randy, you weren't at the last meeting, so I just want to make sure that you note that we captured that here for you. Very important. I agree. Hopefully something that will not go unnoticed by legislators, especially in a budget cycle. And then we've also included a list of references of different sections where the Consolidated Housing Plan is currently appears in Connecticut general statutes, which I think is important as the state considers how to better align housing planning. On our first recommendation, we discussed last time moving a housing needs assessment to 5 years versus a biennial process due to staffing and also the fact that data does tend to lag a couple years behind, in many cases, housing data as well as population data. We had a discussion in our last meeting about whether there should be interim data assessments. So acknowledging that a full housing needs assessment happening every 5 years, perhaps in alignment with the consolidated plan, is good. But what we saw in the last 2 years alone shows that the housing market and housing needs can change drastically in a short period of time. And so there was a general agreement among the group last time that it would be helpful to have periodic data assessment in between, at least once in between that 5-year period. So I've included that recommendation here. I think both Jim and some other folks brought up a question of what particular data points the interim data plan should track and whether that's something this group wants to recommend. And so we had made a note in here to ask DOH whether there's any specific thoughts on particular data points we want to recommend as a group that the Department of Housing consider in such an interim report. So I want to pause at this bracket and see if Randy has any thoughts on that, or if anybody, one of Randy's colleagues perhaps may want to provide some suggestions on that between meetings.
Yeah, I forwarded this to Michael, so he's in the process of going through it, and he would definitely be the person to get back to me.
Okay. All right.
Kylie, is part of the question here what the assessment itself should track, right? So it's not just what the interim data plan should track, but also what this thing in general should track, because right now there isn't a whole lot of.
Good point.
And I'm happy to.
Particular attention should be paid to racial and income segregation and track those and other metrics from year to year, and recommended reviewing geographic dispersion of housing insecurity and the corresponding opportunity map elements, which includes jobs, employment opportunities, quality education. But if you have thoughts on being more specific here, building this out? Anika, perhaps with some bullets on a housing needs assessment should include the following elements. I'm happy to work
Yeah,
that.
as you know, I've been looking into this and I haven't had a chance to put it in writing yet, but I don't want people to see it for the first time in November. So if you don't mind, I'll take a minute to just talk a little bit about that now.
Go ahead.
So I took a look at some other states and how they do this, and other states have dealt with the same problem we've dealt with, which is that they're required to have a con plan, but the con plan doesn't capture everything they'd like to capture. So some of them have a separate affordable housing plan, I guess not unlike this document. And some of them bake things into their con plan.
Yeah.
A couple things that that seemed relevant, and I'm not gonna, I'll be a little bit more specific about this, I guess, when I put some information in the thing, but Oregon is a state that looks at goals in terms of housing production. They also look at resident cost burden, which is something I think is missing from ours right now.
Yeah.
As well as homeownership promotion, particularly in communities of color. Minnesota's affordable housing plan looks at racial and socioeconomic equity goals, including first-time home buyer mortgages going to communities of color and new construction. California and New Jersey both set out unit production targets. New Jersey's is for affordable only. California's is at all income levels. And I think those unit targets are also something we ought to add here. And then because, outside of looking at other states, we also looked at indicators that sort of policy experts and think tanks look at. And a couple of those that I think are missing from here are vacancy rates, data around people's experience in the neighborhoods where they're located. So percentage of residents who say they feel safe in their neighborhood, for example, is all tied to housing. And then building code violations and resident turnover as other kind of indicators that might be useful. What percentage of home buyers and tenants who are income eligible actually receive housing subsidies?
Yeah.
That one is interesting to me because I had occasion to look at that one recently for something unrelated to this, and found that, I think a lot of us are now familiar with the statistic that just 20 to 25% of income eligible households receive subsidies at all, because
Right.
in the kind of like Matthew Desmond evicted world. But it turns out that something like 45% of elderly households that are eligible for subsidies receive them, which I just found notable given the towns around here to insist on developing affordable housing for elderly people only because they need it more or something. So anyway, that's just, I will write this all up, but I didn't want people to be hearing it for the first time or seeing it for the first time just before our final meeting. So I figured I'd just put that out there now.
Thank you. And I know you said you mentioned you had to leave early, so I appreciate all that. I've made some shorthand notes here, and once we get some more specific information from you, I'll bake it in below. And then Randy, I'll wait, see if Mike has any additional thoughts on data points for the housing needs assessment or the interim report. And I'll try to set out something that includes sort of a longer list, perhaps of data points or indicators. And we'll try to get that out to you all as soon as I can, so you can see it as well, the sort of full draft as well in advance of next meeting as possible. I know you all want to spend your Thanksgiving reviewing it.
Oh yeah, sure. Anika, one thing, when we consider cost burdened households, I'm just thinking out loud, could we look at somehow the income tiers that those people are in So that, for example, and I'll tell you what the problem I'm trying to solve is that when we dug into our own data, not for this, but when we do data points to measure in the future, we've already got this for now, that's fine. But then when we're looking at the future and we're looking at metrics for the future, one of the things I discovered is that a lot of high income people are also cost burdened. And I don't think we want to be addressing that, right?
Well, so a couple things. So one, there is data that breaks it down so that you can
Mhm.
look solely at low-income people who are cost burdened if you'd
Good.
like. And I think that
Yeah.
that's right. I think that's important. I think that's a
Yeah.
different problem from the other thing, which I also think is a problem because it's bad for the state as an economic development thing for even, maybe not the wealthiest of the wealthy, I don't care
Exactly.
about, but for, for like professional class
No,
people. No, let me finish,
Yeah.
Margarita. I'll let you know when I'm done.
Okay.
I'll give you an example. Shortly after I moved to Connecticut in 2007, 2008 or something, I was working at a law firm and I was, a junior associate, mid-level associate at a law firm in Connecticut. And I had a client, my law firm had a client that was like a financial firm based in Atlanta. And they offered me a job. And they offered me a job. The general counsel at the firm never told me, and over the course of 3 or 4 phone calls trying to convince me to come down to Atlanta to get a sense of what this job would be like. Over the course of 3 or 4 phone calls, never told me what he would pay me. Right? Like, we never got to that point in the conversation because I just gotten married, was pretty settled in New Haven, did not have the intention of going anywhere. But what he definitely told me was how much house you could buy for $500,000 in the city of Atlanta. Like, his primary pitch was cost of living, and he was absolutely right. Like 100%, I could have lived in like a, whatever he was going to pay me. I could have moved into a 6,000 square foot McMansion in Atlanta that I could not afford in most places in Connecticut. So the fact that we have people who are cost burdened on paper, even if they're reasonably well off, means that we're losing them to jobs in other states where they don't have to be cost burdened for the same amount of house, same amount of, quality of life as what they're getting here. So I think it's a different problem, but it's still a problem. And this commission is, as a whole, is looking at an array of policy that is not just about affordable housing. It's about the future of the state. So I do think that those numbers are still important, even if they're not they're a different problem than the first problem you identified.
So if I may speak now? May I speak now? Are you done? Yes?
Margaret, you can see that I muted myself, so yes. I'm
Okay,
done.
no, I didn't. You're little in my screen. Okay, so just exactly, I agree 100% with you. A huge concern for me is what happens to professionals coming into the workforce. Can they afford to buy starter homes? All of that. But what I can tell you is that there are cases where the very rich are in these numbers, and that is very annoying. Because if they choose to cost burden themselves, I don't have a whole lot of sympathy. I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't be so blunt, but I agree with you 100%, Anika. We have to keep the ability, we have to somehow grow, not just at the lower income level, but at all levels where you have workforce has to find housing that works for them, that functions for them. So yeah, agree with you. But it's irritating when it's the very rich who are cost burdening themselves for whatever reason they do.
Right, so we have, we know that a large portion, if not vast majority of the extremely low income households are housing cost burdened, or in many
Yep.
cases they're double up, and that's 142,000 out of the 200 renter households that are cost burdened. So we're talking about renter households here. We're not talking about people who own, in this particular statistic.
Yep. And I've poured through all that data on the renters who are rich. And I'm just saying, can we focus it on the affordability? Middle tier is good. It's a great tier to grab if it's within our scope. I 100% agree. We got to get the missing middle as well, because it's folks that people forget also need a place to live.
So we'll do some breakdown here.
Yeah.
That data is available, so Kaylee and I can add that in. All right. I'm going to move past the housing needs assessment. As I noted, we'll flush that out with some additional information from Randy and Anika, but you heard Anika's, I think, some good research here on what other states are doing as far as housing planning. And there may be elements of your work here, Anika, that can go in other sections too. So we'll do our best to sort that out. We talked about tailoring plans to communities. Not much change here. We talked about adding factors like mill rates, grand lists, and availability of flexible municipal resources as considerations in looking at something the state should look at in its housing planning space. Otherwise, this section remains unchanged. The identifying opportunities for incentives and rehabilitation. Randy notes that this is something that is at least partially, if not largely, there are components of the existing consolidated plan that address this. I left it in though for now for the purposes of noting that whether it's a consolidated plan or a larger housing planning document, that it's an important element given the age of our housing, particularly that middle, small multifamily, middle type housing. We've talked about healthy housing quite a bit, and this also touches on the rehab issues. We included a section here that talks about broader state housing policy guidance, perhaps identifying other state and local funding resources for upgrades and improvements to privately owned multifamily homes, which comprise a good amount of our state's rental stock. And we had a brief conversation about that last time. Why low rents and housing values often result in low or no support in private financing for such repairs, or are economically disadvantageous for owners, and why more resources are going to be necessary in order to deal with our housing quality issues in some of that small multifamily stock. Then we get into the expanding evaluation of prior performance section. We had a pretty robust discussion about that last time. This too is a place where we can plug in some of the national best practices here. I know Anika's been looking at that. Will sent some more information that we'll be adding in. And I know, Margarita, I checked in the your issue or your question about inclusionary zoning and local housing funds is included in the other work group plan, the Affordable Housing Plan draft, which gives recommendations for towns and legislators on tools that local communities can use. So I promised I would check that for you, and I did. So it's not really in the scope for here, but it is included in one. Yep. I see your hand up. I don't know if that's from before or
just from before, and this may be beyond our scope really quickly. Is there room for us to also say conversion of non-residential buildings into housing? Is that at all within our scope of what we're talking about preservation and rehab? Do non-residential buildings come into that at all? I hadn't thought about it before, and someone asked me about it over the weekend.
It's something that's come, I will say anecdotally, I'm hearing more and more about it, just based, at least in Connecticut, on the fact that we have sort of a decreasing interest in retail and office space, but an increase in housing. The conversation about conversion comes up, and not all conversions are created equal, right? It's very building dependent. But we could, I think there are funds that can be used for conversions. And so I think I'm fine with adding in a line if other folks are here too in this incentives to rehabilitation and preservation about particularly looking at building conversion opportunities.
I don't think it's relevant to anything in this document. I mean, this document's about housing goals, like whether that housing gets built in office building conversion or not. Who cares?
Okay. All right. Okay.
All right. Some of this too, when we talk about where housing should go, it's really not our place to say to DOH or whoever's doing the housing planning, you should look at putting housing here or doing this type of housing. It's to make sure that there's a plan and what might be considered in that consolidated plan or broader plan, I guess. So,
Hold on, Kylie, I'm not sure that that's right. I mean, if we think that they ought to be, if we think that there are planning considerations that they ought to undertake in making those decisions, then that goes in here, right?
it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's, you're right. It's, for example, the section where we talk about considering employment opportunities and where transit and all those other things. We do have that section in there. So.
And we could certainly say existing infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
Like that's also all those towns
Yeah.
and train stations, right? Existing infrastructure, that's perfectly fine as a planning consideration as well.
Yes. I'll figure out where to put that. Sorry. Hard to facilitate and type at the same time for me. Okay. Well, let's get back to where we were. So, we talked about that. All right. So expanding on private performance, Jim, you had a comment last time about being more specific about what we want to measure and assess why a program or portion of the plan did not work and what recommendations might exist for ensuring a different, more successful strategy is used moving forward. I'm hoping, and looking at Will's stuff, which I haven't gotten a chance to look at, Will and Anika's, it will get some more specific language about what we would measure and recommendations. But Jim, if you have more specific thoughts yourself that you want to send my way here, go ahead. We'll be working to flesh this out. Will, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much time. I mostly to your point, as I was putting the stuff together that I sent you, the intersection with the amount of stuff that Anika was referencing earlier in the needs assessment, the sort of, you can't evaluate performance without aligning it with strategy. And so that's where a lot of mine gets built. And I wonder actually if that's caused to move this section up to right under the needs assessment so that they speak to each other
There's a
more
lot of
directly in the
overlap.
recommendations.
Yeah, I'm thinking this. Okay. Order that. Any other thoughts on evaluation of prior performance? This will be a section that will include some changes the next time you see it. So this, and I think the housing needs assessment will be the places where you want to focus your attention on the new version of this.
And I don't have any thoughts at this moment on how to define or to build that out, but I promise I'll contemplate it a little more and have some advice or thoughts at our
You
next
may have
meeting.
some others, Jim, that fall, more in your wheelhouse that I think could add something to this report. So a different element to the report. So feel free to do that. On the non-funding housing strategies, one of the recommendations we had is to look at, or at least consider the fact that there are lots of actors, but also funding streams, but actors outside of DOH and HUD that influence the housing development and housing rehabilitation world, and that we recommend that they consider the actions, roles, and better plan for sort of housing in a way that takes into account those other actors, municipalities being one of those. And Randy noted too that one of the challenges of the con plan is that they're held accountable. The state is held accountable by HUD for that con plan. And so where particular actors may be referenced in a larger housing planning document, the con plan or not, that there's a challenge there of being held accountable for actions or lack of actions by actors that may otherwise be included in here. So I did, Randy, build in a caveat that just says we understand that DOH cannot be held accountable for the actions of outside actors. Evaluating progress on the accountability or the consolidated plan will necessarily involve taking into account where investments were successful and where other factors mean that the plan outcome was not reachable and should be reconsidered in future plan development. So I hope that that sort of gets at that point, but if folks have other thoughts on that or suggested edits, please let me know.
Kylie, just raise, I don't think you can see the raised hand function because you're.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I see
No, that's
some of
okay.
you all, but I have to keep.
normally bother to raise my hand, but at this time I did, and it occurred to me that it didn't matter.
Sorry, I can only see like 4 of you at a time, so I have to keep scrolling. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think this is a little bit of a, I mean, I don't think you can, what am I going to
I
say
know.
here? Sometimes my kids misbehave in public, and sometimes it's my fault, and sometimes it's not.
Right.
And similarly, sometimes like Westport misbehaves, or you know, I don't know, New Canaan.
Or a
Sometimes
developer
it's
falls
DOH's
through.
fault and sometimes it's not. So
Yeah.
I don't think we can say like, oh, sorry, there are other people here. And you know, DOH and the state have legislative and regulatory authority. There's like a constitution that some people might consider enforcing from time to time, as well as some state statutes. I mean, I don't think we can say that DOH can't be held accountable for the actions of outside actors. That's literally their job. So
That actually literally, Anika, I'm sorry, it actually literally is not in every circumstance. There are, I mean, we're limited by our statutory authority. So my point
Yeah,
is,
but
we can't enforce something that we don't have statutory ability to enforce. I understand. I know what you're getting at. I know the examples you're giving, and I know the arguments you're trying to make right now, but we don't have the statutory authority to control a municipality or to control even a housing authority, or I mean, there's limits in what the statutes. I know people would like it to be otherwise, but there are limits as to what the Department of Housing, any state agency, is limited by what it is authorized in the statutes to do.
And
so I'm just going to say we're not going to agree that we have the responsibility to hold accountable your toddlers. I mean, you know, it's different. It's totally a different situation. I think you're casting aspersions where they're not called for.
The most powerful lobbyist in the Connecticut General Assembly are the state agencies, right? DOT goes in there and they say what they want. DEEP goes in there, they say what they want. All of the state agencies walk in, they don't get what they want necessarily. I am not suggesting that they do, but I don't know that there's another lobbying force other than state agencies that gets the audience that state agencies do, right?
So there's a difference.
So let me finish. There is a role for DOH to play, not just in enforcing laws, but in getting them passed. I am not suggesting that you have unlimited authority. Obviously, it has limits, but it is not as simple as to say, oh, there's a law. We can only enforce what the law says. I mean, sort of like you can also play a role in crafting the law. Like there's room for doing good, and there's more room that you could take up that I don't think we necessarily take up just yet, and there's a certain lack of political will. And all of that is just to say that it's too simple to say we can only do what the statutes permit us to do, because the statutes change every single year, and there's space for advocacy.
If I might, there's a difference though between saying that we need to be accountable for ultimately what happens. I mean, I would hate to give you a list of legislative initiatives that the commissioner has testified in support of. Believe me, I wish we could go into legislature and get them to do what we wanted, but you know, the separation of powers is strong among us, and you know, we certainly support plenty of initiatives that do not get passed, and you know, the political will is really sometimes truly not in our control. But I understand what you're saying. I'm not suggesting that we would just step back and say, and you know, whatever will happen will happen. But I think the way it was initially drafted was putting an accountability on us, right? Because whoever's responsible for accomplishing what's in a plan, without a recognition that ultimately, you know, if a municipality or a housing authority or legislature or whoever decides to act in a way that notwithstanding whatever our position might be, that ultimately we can't force, you know, a lot of people, I'll give you an example. A lot of people contact me and they cannot understand why I cannot force their landlord to do something about their, you know, the conditions in their unit or their rent going up too high. And I have to understand, I have to explain, like, I can't force a landlord to do something because I don't have authority to do that. So I just want to make
laws in the
sure.
books about that too. I mean,
Correct.
okay.
There are laws on the books, but okay, that's a far afield example. But Anika, there are laws on the books about that. But if you look at the laws, they're landlord tenant laws, they're not enforceable by the state agency of the Department of Housing. They're not. If you think otherwise, Anika, please email me separately and show me, because I would love to know where I can go in and tell a landlord what to do.
So Will has his hands up, so I just want to finish off this colloquy, I think, and then Will should. So, as a matter of just basic local and state government law, the towns and the housing authorities are all creatures of the state. To the extent that we have made it hard for ourselves to hold those bodies accountable, we did it to ourselves, right? I can't see how, under those circumstances, we can say that the state isn't accountable for those failures. We set up the towns, the state of Connecticut set up the towns, set up the housing authorities, according to pursuant to section 8-40 of the Connecticut General Statutes. Right? These are all fictions. The state of Connecticut exists in the US Constitution. Everything else is a legal fiction. I don't know why we would sort of tie ourselves up in knots to excuse ourselves for those bodies' failures. That's all I would say. The towns largely have jurisdiction over housing codes and housing code enforcement. They're also your regulatees. I don't know. A tenant called me saying that their landlord had a conditions issue. I'd call the city attorney of the town that they're residing in and send out the code enforcement officer.
Well, of course I would call, but I can't force them to do it. But you know what? This
That's
is not everybody. I know Kylie has limited time. I'm happy if you want to take this up. It touches on a lot of different issues. We'll just look at the language and, you know, make any more comments if we need to. But
Yeah, I'm happy. It's an interesting lawyer.
But the Department of Housing is not, I mean, the Department of Housing is different than the legislature that created, you know, it's just in the statutes I guess it's different when you've never worked for a state agency, you know, in terms of what the statutes limit you from doing. But I know I don't want to take up more time.
I think too, this section refers to, you know, where we're suggesting that perhaps the state should consider going beyond the consolidated plan and engaging in larger housing planning that aligns other types of documents and funding or non-housing funding strategies that were here. Acknowledging that while it may be DOH that leads this planning process, DOH is not going to be the only actor that would be held accountable for a larger planning process, right? There are other entities that would have buy-in for this, CHAPA, for example, but also potentially municipalities. So I don't think it's just DOH on the hook here, but there's probably a way to word this, and my legal brain isn't firing as well as both of yours right now, that kind of gets at the intersection of what Randy's suggesting, which is there are limitations to their ability to implement, but there's also solutions for overcoming those challenges, some harder than others. So if the two of you want to try to work out some language, that's great. I will try to massage it myself to get to a place where it's does the best I can at meeting in the middle. I'll jump to Will though, since he's has his hand up, but thank you both of you.
Yeah, I mean, what I hear is to reveal my bias. I'm sort of broadly inclined on the sort of like we should expand the boundaries of what is of the possible as far as we can in general. I wonder how much of this is about the definition of strategies and goals. Like I can say I'm at the housing authority here. We have certain metrics that we're directly accountable to HUD for, but as I'm working on policy work, I'm directly considered like my sense of what I'm considering is far broader than the metrics that I'm responsible to HUD for. I think like the way that we define our goals is going to shape how and how we define accountability strictly is going to play a pretty big role in what this means. And I think if we're doing any broad housing planning, we would be mistaken to not try to make assumptions about the way that other actors would work and not pull on every lever possible, including going to the legislature when necessary. If we're doing sort of broad planning activities, again, this is like who's responsible, what's responsibility, what are our goals, right. But it feels like there is a sort of middle ground here that's workable for the purposes of this draft.
Okay. I'm gonna work us through the remaining sections here. On this last one, there's a question in here for Rebecca. There was a POCD element at the end of this section. And particularly, this section goes on to talk about other actors in the housing space, including CHAFA and CDFIs, municipalities, PHAs. It also talks about recommendations for non-funding strategies, such as upzoning, for example, or increasing building permits. Rebecca, you noted that the state POCD should deal with housing more directly. And perhaps some of these recommendations, upzoning being one, would better fit within the state land use plan. Could these two be aligned? Rebecca or Randy like to work on. So the question is, do we want a paragraph in here that talks about the POCD, or do folks feel that's too far outside the scope and we should leave that to the jurisdiction of the state to consider how it would best like to align the POCD among other planning documents with this, or do we want to be explicit and talk about that alignment?
Kylie, can I jump in for a second? I'm wondering if, given the context of the just previous discussion, if we shouldn't, or I guess I would advocate for a more broad statement of whatever vehicle you use here for a broader housing plan, that it be put in context through a more comprehensive plan like the state POCD with other state objectives, around economic development, transportation, resilience, and all of those other issues, not only to help coalesce maybe funding around a variety of issues, but also just to ensure that those housing goals are treated on the same level or considered on the same level as other objectives.
Rebecca, since my experience with POCD is mostly my Harper space, would you want to shoot me a sentence or a paragraph of a couple sentences that kind of gets at that broader statement?
Sure.
Really appreciate that. I will. I made a note here, and when I get that from you, I'll plug that in and try to make sure it aligns with the rest of the section. But that's fine with me if it's fine with others. What Rebecca just described in terms of aligning documents like the POCD and the elements it incorporates with a broader housing plan, which is what we're suggesting. Sam? Oh, I saw Anika too. I don't know.
No, Sam should go first. I've been talking a lot.
Oh yeah, sorry that I came late. I was at a conflict. One thing I just saw was that talking about how Connecticut has some of the highest housing costs in the nation. What is the source of that data? Is it the total cost of housing? Because I was looking at median home sales. We're the lowest in the Northeast, except for Vermont, for median home price. And for rents, I just came from the National Planning Conference was in California, and the topic of many of the sessions was housing. In California, the median home sale price is over 800,000, and ours is about 300. Of course, that's home sales, not rentals. But I'm just wondering what the source of that data, and if it's the holistic cost of home ownership or housing, meaning utilities and rent and taxes and mortgage and insurance, or just rent. But if we're going to make that statement, there should be a citation.
The 10th highest housing cost with rental and home ownership costs. The 10th highest housing cost is from American Community Survey data, which is based on Census Bureau data. So
Is there a table
I'm not-
number for that?
I can ask Kaylee to pull where it came up. This is this year came out. We were 9, if I recall, last year, and we went up to 10. But
Kylie, that's that 10th highest is a link, and it links to the out of reach report from National.
okay, so that's National Income Housing Coalition then.
Okay.
So-
Because
On that link, you'll see it's reports.nlihc.org, and you go to the Connecticut page, and it gives you some information on their methodology in that report. Sam,
do you mind putting that in the chat, that link?
sure.
Great, thank you.
Kaylee, can you do that while I'm getting to our next section?
Yep,
Yeah.
will do.
National Income Housing Out of Reach and the Gap reports are really great for identifying Connecticut specific data. It's usually based on census information, and those come out annually.
Yeah, because like based on the dollar cost, at least from the purchasing side, our median home prices are much lower than other parts of the country. But that's just one data point. It also doesn't go into the fact that our housing is older, has more maintenance needs.
Yep, we have a section in the report that talks about that earlier
Yeah.
on. We talked about the age of Connecticut's housing and the need for funding for and direction of funds for rehabilitation, particularly of older rental stock.
But just by the comparison to California, we're there's no comparison to the situation in California, which probably
I don't think there's
is
any
worse.
comparison to California.
Probably Hawaii. Hawaii is
Yeah,
probably comparable.
Maybe.
But say we're the highest, and our median home sale prices maybe 60% of what they are in California is.
We're the 10th highest, so yeah, still higher than most of the rest of the country, though. Anika, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just back to the POCD. I think one thing that's, I agree with everything that was said about context and balancing, making sure housing needs is part of the mix. I think one thing that's complicated about this area, I guess it harkens a little bit back to the earlier conversation, is just around enforcement. And I don't know, I don't know if it's worth saying something about in here about, this is a whatever 11-page memo at this point about good planning, but there still isn't enough in there perhaps still isn't enough in the POCD or elsewhere or in statutes around the POCD that that really digs into enforceability.
What happens when we set goals and don't attain them repeatedly?
Or try.
Yeah, that too.
And Kylie, can I just jump in that there's another working group making recommendations on the state C&D plan and implementation. So it will tie into that.
Yeah, I'm trying to avoid too much overlap to your point, Rebecca, for, my note with Margarita later where another report is specifically addressing something and it's more in their scope. But I think talking about the alignment of a document like the POCD along with the elements that go in that is important for what we're talking about here. So.
And to not sound like Pollyanna, if we could, in the POCD, you get to build community consensus and you get to hopefully get support to expanding housing options so that folks buy in. I don't see it as an enforcement, but really getting people to buy into the concept that it's what's right to do.
I love it when my fundamental rights are the subject of a community conversation. That sounds
No,
awesome.
not you, not your fundamental
just
rights. I mean,
anybody,
when I write the
part of it.
POCD, I would like my community to be in the process of buying into doing these things and putting them forward because they have, they shouldn't be forced to do it. It's the stick approach. It should be instead that they see that it's the right thing.
Yeah, we should definitely force people to sleep on the street because your neighbors don't want to be forced to see an affordable housing.
I don't know where you're
House.
getting that, Anika. Back down. I'm saying that when you're doing the POCD, you're not doing enforcement. You're doing building a vision. a positive
I
one,
guess I
hope.
agree with you. I guess.
Guys, you
guess
do
with you
agree
that we are
with me.
building a lot of visions and not a lot of housing.
Yeah, yes, I think there's some agreement there. Also, I understand the concept, but when we're talking about
Okay.
someone's
Um,
human rights, it gets
This
difficult.
part, this next part is super important.
Okay, so this is the last section. I could jump off shortly, so I want to make sure we get through it. So Kaylee did a good job of building this out, and we at the partnership have been working on this internally through some of our work as well. But we tried to flesh this out a little more instead of just recommending that individuals with lived expertise be part of the planning process, and their input intentionally included. We also included some of the things we work on here, which is ensuring that folks are compensated for that expertise and their time, and what that looks like. So offering training and orientation, planning time to support participants in that process, flexible meeting times, and other things to ensure that whatever housing planning process goes into this document includes a wide variety of input, not just from folks like all of us on this call, right, but individuals who are much closer to the solutions than many of us are. And that's a broad assumption I'm making, but including folks who experience the challenges of neighbors who don't want affordable housing, or who have it's on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely.
Any other thoughts on this section beyond what Kaylee has built out here? I'm happy to expand this if folks have additional thought here.
No, I spend a lot of time thinking about the funding part, and that somehow and this could be enforcement. So because it's not the POCD, somehow we've got to get people, towns, municipalities to fund affordable housing. And I don't know how to make that point more strongly. I've talked to Anika offline about it. We were emailing about it. Because it is important, and I think we need new statutes for it, and I've been trying to work on that with different folks. But if there's room to amplify that, I just believe very strongly that we really should press people to fund affordable housing at the municipal level.
Yep, there's lots of different ways to do that. I believe the AHP group is tackling some of those. So we talked
Yes,
about
you did. You said
those,
that.
The funds, but there's also through tax abatements, through density bonus developers, through other things towns can, or financial advisory.
And there's the state level, which hopefully the AHP group would get to. I don't know if any of you have heard any idea of that, but if at the state level, and this is back to the DOH question, if towns that didn't had a gap in their affordable housing, or even in their housing options, somehow had a requirement to put in some kind of funds, and that was a state statute, is that something we could touch? Or is that off of the table for our scope? I mean, just slap me down if it is, no worries.
I'm not sure what kind of funds you're talking about, but I mean,
Yeah.
if you're talking about impact fees, then yes, that is off the table by statute.
No, I don't mean
think the
impact
question is, like,
fees.
is it in the purview of this group? And I don't think.
Yeah.
Okay,
I don't
all right.
think
If it's
this
not in the
stuff
purview.
is in the
Yep.
purview of this group.
Yeah, I
but-
lean with Anika on
Okay.
that. I think
Okay.
it's a valuable conversation, Margarita.
Yeah.
States have done this, and making sure that it's equitable, anyway, that
I'm working on it with other
Yeah.
people, so no worries. Anika's already heard me on it. I happen to be a little fixated on the idea of funding. So, yeah, if it's not our scope, I
I
take
think
it all
it falls
back.
within the con plan component, but
Okay.
yeah. Anything else on the lived expertise component?
No, it's so good.
Okay. And then in the end, just in order to include a conclusion, even though it's highlighted at the top, I asked Kaylee to put together a conclusion that also just has a summary statement. That way, folks can access sort of the summaries in brief or more lengthy form, depending on where they look in the report. The goal, they're trying to make sure that this is read and accessible. If folks, we may have to update some of these based on our conversation day or reorder them as it were. But that's all this is really, is to try to create a concise place, a conclusion and summary for those who prefer to read the Cliff Notes rather than read the prior 10 pages. I will say the Affordable Housing Plan report is now over 40 pages because I'm part of that too. So 10, 11 pages feels pretty manageable to me, but if folks have anything else they want to add in the interim, please email me. If as we were going through this, I identified a place where you might send me some information, Rebecca, others, please. Ideally, if you can do that in the next 1 to 2 weeks, that would be great. That way, Kaylee and I can work on trying to finalize this. We have the State Affordable Housing Conference coming up in a few weeks, so we're going to be tied up with that. It's the week before Thanksgiving, so my goal will be to try to get something out to you in advance of that, so you have time to review it before our 11:30, our meeting on November 30th. And I'll note too, if there's any deal breaker for you in that report I send out prior to 11:30, please let me know before the meeting, because I'd love to try to get to a conclusory place at the end of November. So if there's something that's going to prevent you from signing on, knowing that we're not all going to love everything in here, but if it's something we can largely get behind, then that's our task. That would be great. Sam?
Yeah, I just put in the chat just a suggested clarification for that 10th highest housing cost, because that methodology is for low income households struggling to afford to live here, and that's where we rank 10th. But for the overall housing market, that's not what the Low Income Housing Coalition's methodology is ranking. It's ranking affordability for low income households, and that's where we're 10th worst. And that's where you get the sort of the confusing situation where our median home prices are actually lower than our neighbors, but it's still a challenge and a struggle for many people to live here. So it's the hardship is not uniformly spread out. It's overly concentrated on low income households. That's no surprise to us here. But I think that needs to be highlighted, because when you look at just the median numbers, which is the 50th percentile, we don't look bad.
Okay, we'll make a point to clarify that or provide some other data, as it were, to housing permits or other information.
Yeah, it's we're a high cost state. It costs a lot to live here. And incomes are, particularly for low-income households, are not. It doesn't compensate for that. And then you throw in rents, particularly for that methodology is just focused on rents. It's just looking at their data inputs, it shows the problem, but it needs to be sort of more specified as not as really focused on the struggle for a lower income, which is the whole affordable housing issue.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what this report is focused on. These are the funding streams that the Consolidated largely address.
And Sam, that goes a little bit. Hi, Sam. It's great to see you. That goes a little bit to what I was saying earlier, is to break down those income tiers, because you want to get to where the greatest need is, right? Prioritize it, even though you also know you have areas.
You're not agreeing. Sam doesn't want to get to where the need is, and you do want to get to where the need is. It's what I'm not really
Sam,
sure.
okay, wait.
But I
Let
think
Sam. Anika, why don't you let Sam talk for himself?
So
Sam, go ahead.
Well, so the need is not equally distributed across all income levels. It's focused on low income households. That's where our issues are. And we just completed our regional housing plan, and the problem is that we don't have housing in a lot of the state for people making 30% of median income. And that's unfortunately what our essential service jobs pay, if that. And that's still getting paid well above minimum wage. So we need these people in our communities. We invite them to come in during the day, but there's nowhere for them to live. And 830G is focused on 60 and 80% of AMI. yet when we really have a need for housing for people making 30% of AMI. And that's where the need is really focused.
The need is actually 50% AMI and below is where the largest need here is. Yeah.
And I think, and unfortunately, I think that to really realize any progress in those areas, it's going to take public investment.
Yes, there you go. Okay. I mean, that's the thing, that once you're at those very low income tiers, you need funding. That's what I'm obsessed with. I know I'm obsessed, you guys, but you've got to get money. You've got to get public investment into that, because there is no other way. The income streams aren't enough. The finance guys that I've been working with keep saying that. Okay, I'll stop, because I think you guys said this wasn't totally our calling, but yes, that I think we were on the same page.
Will, and then we'll try to wrap up here.
Yeah, I don't want to drag this out longer than necessary, but like, I think the idea that for the specific relevance of this, the idea that somehow housing has intrinsic income streams that it's affiliated with doesn't make any sense. I live in a very old, kind of terrible apartment in an incredibly expensive neighborhood, and if we built more housing at other levels, maybe my apartment would be cheaper. So I don't want us to get caught up in we need one versus the other. Like, we need a lot of everything. We need more subsidy. We need more housing. Like, I would push back on the idea that somehow because we need a lot more housing at the lowest income level means that that's not reason to pay attention to middle and workforce housing.
Right. All right. Any other questions before we wrap up?
Yeah, I wasn't making a comment on. I was just making a comment about the cost of housing, and that was the only thing I was making a comment on. However, you realize a more affordable housing, or whether I'm agnostic to that. I think you need to have multiple approaches, but my only concern is that the cheapest housing is generally the worst housing. It's the underinvested housing. And that in itself is a problem.
Right, and I think that ties back to some of the conditions stuff in here about aging housing stock and conditions and what happens when you never build anything new.
Right.
You're right, they're all of these issues are intertwined. I think Will's right, Sam's right. That is true.
All right, everyone. As I noted, I will send out we'll do our best to send out an updated report before the next meeting. Please review that. If you promise to get me information, please do that. Kaylee and I are really trying to do this amidst all of our other work. And so we really appreciate you providing us with some research, so we're not doing it all ourselves, or data or language, and we'll do our best to work that in. And hopefully we can get to some conclusion on this at the next meeting. If we can't, there's always December, but December's a crazy month. If your life is like mine, and I think we're close to having this finalized, we could sit and probably debate the fine tune this for months and months to come, and what we want to include or how we want to word stuff. So acknowledging that it'll never be perfect, but we can get this to a place where we feel like we have some solid recommendations that we agree on. That's the goal for me.
And Kylie, there's some language that's really, really good in here that just, okay. it in case you're feeling that we're discouraging and that we argue a lot.
No,
I throw ideas out that aren't part of our call, but there's some language in here that is excellent. It really is.
I hope we can,
at least in my view, I think we've gotten some really good points across.
Good. And thank you all for your time and dedication, continuing to come to these meetings and put in your opinions and effort. I appreciate it. All right, with that, I'll let you all go. Thank you again. We'll see you again. I hope, if I don't see you before the holidays or before Thanksgiving, I hope you all have a lovely fall. Enjoy Halloween, Thanksgiving. We'll see you soon.